In the bitter winter of 1789, along the treacherous mountain passes connecting Boston to the western settlements of Massachusetts, the Thornfield family way station became the center of the most calculated series of murders ever documented in post-colonial New England. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Ashworth, a former Continental Army surgeon turned territorial commissioner, filled 6 detailed journals with evidence of a matriarchal killing enterprise that used frontier hospitality as both weapon and shield. Widow Helena Thornfield and her 3 daughters appeared to be model frontier businesswomen, compassionate, skilled in medicine and commerce, and indispensable to travelers braving the harsh New England wilderness. But beneath their reputation for saving lives lay a methodical murder operation that preyed upon the most defenseless souls seeking passage to America's western territories. For 11 months, 31 traders, missionaries, and pioneer families vanished completely after seeking shelter at Thornfield's way station, along with horses, wagons, and personal effects valued at over 8,000 colonial pounds. The official Massachusetts territorial records were classified by state authorities and locked away in Boston's government vaults for over 200 years. But the truth about the Thornfield women reveals how easily civilized society can harbor predators who understand that compassion can become the deadliest trap, and that maternal instincts can mask the most ruthless criminal minds in American history. Before we journey into the dark heart of the Thornfield mystery and uncover the systematic horror that terrorized Massachusetts' western frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's most chilling historical cases. Drop a comment below telling us what state you're watching from. We love building our community of true crime history enthusiasts who aren't afraid to confront the darkest chapters of our nation's past. The Massachusetts of 1789 existed in a state of dramatic transformation. The newly formed United States had won its independence, but the vast wilderness territories west of the established coastal settlements remained largely unexplored and extremely dangerous. The Berkshire Mountains created a formidable natural barrier between the civilized eastern towns like Boston, Springfield, and Worcester, and the untamed western regions where hardy pioneers hoped to establish new communities and claim virgin land for farming and timber operations. Winter travel through these mountain passes was particularly treacherous. Blizzards could trap travelers for days or weeks, temperatures regularly dropped well below freezing, and the narrow mountain trails became nearly impassable when covered with snow and ice. Even experienced outdoorsmen could easily become lost in the maze of similar-looking valleys and ridges that characterized the western Massachusetts landscape. For settlers traveling with families, elderly relatives, or limited supplies, a winter journey through the Berkshires could quickly become a death sentence. Yet economic necessity drove hundreds of people to attempt these dangerous crossings each year. The western lands offered opportunities that simply did not exist in the crowded eastern settlements. Fertile soil could be claimed for minimal cost, timber rights could generate substantial income, and early settlers who established successful communities often became wealthy and influential as later waves of migration arrived. For families struggling with debt, unemployment, or social restrictions in the established communities, the Western territories represented their only hope for economic advancement and social mobility. Into this environment of opportunity mixed with mortal danger, Helena Thornfield had established what appeared to be a godsend for desperate travelers. Her way station occupied a strategic location at the intersection of 2 major mountain passes, positioned where exhausted travelers would naturally seek shelter and supplies before attempting the final, most dangerous portion of their westward journey. Helena Thornfield herself presented a figure that inspired immediate confidence and trust. A woman of approximately 45 years, she possessed the sturdy build and weathered features of someone accustomed to hard physical labor, but her manner was refined and educated in a way that suggested a more genteel background. She spoke with the crisp diction of the educated Massachusetts elite, could read and write fluently, and demonstrated knowledge of medical practices, herbal remedies, and business accounting that far exceeded what most frontier women possessed. Helena's personal history, as she related it to curious guests, was both tragic and inspiring. She claimed to be the widow of Captain Marcus Thornfield, a Continental Army officer who had died heroically at the Battle of Yorktown. Left alone with 3 young daughters and substantial debts from her husband's military service, she had sold her family's Boston property and moved west to establish a business that could support her family while serving the needs of travelers attempting the dangerous mountain crossings. The 3 Thornfield daughters each brought distinctive skills to their family's operation. Constance, the eldest at 26, possessed remarkable strength and stamina that allowed her to perform work typically reserved for men, chopping firewood, caring for horses, and maintaining the waystation's buildings and equipment. Her sisters often joked that Constance could work longer and harder than most frontier men while maintaining the feminine grace and hospitality that made guests feel welcome and comfortable. Prudence, the middle daughter at 23, had inherited her mother's medical knowledge and expanded upon it through extensive study of herbal remedies and frontier surgery techniques. She could treat injuries, illnesses, and emergencies with skill that rivaled formally trained physicians. Many travelers credited Prudence with saving their lives or the lives of their family members, creating a reputation that drew people to the Thornfield Waystation specifically seeking medical treatment. The youngest daughter, Temperance, was barely 20 years old but possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict weather patterns, trail conditions, and the optimal timing for various types of travel. She could examine the sky, feel the wind, and provide weather forecasts that proved remarkably accurate days or even weeks in advance. For travelers whose lives depended on avoiding blizzards or ice storms, Temperance's meteorological gifts were invaluable. Together, the 4 Thornfield women had created what appeared to be the perfect frontier business. Helena managed the overall operation, handling finances, planning, and correspondence with suppliers in Boston and other eastern cities. Constance maintained the physical infrastructure and provided security that made even lone male travelers feel safe. Prudence offered medical services that could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. Temperance provided weather information that helped travelers time their journeys for maximum safety. The waystation itself reflected the family's commitment to providing genuine service to their customers. Unlike many frontier establishments that offered little more than basic shelter and minimal food, the Thornfield operation included well-constructed sleeping quarters, a substantial dining area with a massive stone fireplace, stables that could accommodate numerous horses and vehicles, and storage facilities for travelers who needed to lighten their loads before attempting particularly difficult mountain passages. Helena had invested in quality furnishings that created an atmosphere of comfort and refinement rarely found on the frontier. Her dining area featured actual china dishes rather than wooden bowls, real silverware instead of crude utensils, and linen tablecloths that were regularly cleaned and maintained. The sleeping quarters included real beds with straw mattresses and warm woolen blankets, a luxury that most frontier travelers never experienced. Most impressive was the waystation's inventory of supplies and services. Helena maintained extensive stocks of preserved foods, ammunition, tools, medicines, and winter clothing that could be purchased at reasonable prices. She could arrange for equipment repairs, provide detailed maps and route information, and even organize guide services for travelers who lacked the experience to navigate the mountain passes safely. The Thornfield women also offered specialized services that addressed the unique challenges of frontier travel. Helena would hold letters and messages for extended periods, creating an informal postal system that allowed families to communicate across vast distances.
Constance could provide riding and shooting lessons for inexperienced travelers who needed to develop survival skills quickly. Prudence offered medical consultations and treatment plans for chronic conditions that might worsen during difficult travel. Temperance would create detailed written weather forecasts and travel recommendations tailored to each group's specific route and timeline. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Ashworth first encountered the Thornfield Waystation in October 1788 during her initial survey of the territorial boundaries under her jurisdiction. Ashworth represented a remarkable figure in post-revolutionary America, one of the few women who had served officially in the Continental Army, having worked as a battlefield surgeon under direct commission from General Washington himself. Rebecca's background was both unusual and impressive. Born into a wealthy Boston merchant family, she had received an education typically reserved for men, including formal medical training at Harvard College, under a special arrangement her father had negotiated with the university administration. When the Revolutionary War began, Rebecca had volunteered her medical services and proved so competent that she was eventually granted an official military commission, an almost unprecedented honor for a woman. After the war, Rebecca had been appointed as a territorial commissioner responsible for maintaining law and order across the western Massachusetts territories. Her duties included investigating crimes, resolving disputes, ensuring compliance with territorial regulations, and providing regular reports to the state government about conditions in the frontier regions. Rebecca's medical training had taught her to observe details that others might miss, while her military experience had developed her ability to assess people's character and motivations quickly and accurately. During her overnight stay at the Thornfield Waystation, she noticed several things that struck her as worth remembering, though not necessarily suspicious at the time.
The Thornfield women seemed unusually interested in the specific details of every guest's background, travel plans, and personal circumstances. Helena asked detailed questions about Rebecca's official duties, the frequency of her travel through various territories, and whether her absence from particular locations would be noticed if she were delayed. Constance inquired about Rebecca's physical condition, combat experience, and the weapons she carried for personal protection. Prudence wanted to know about any health problems, medications, or medical conditions that might affect Rebecca's ability to travel or defend herself. Temperance asked about Rebecca's planned route, timeline, and whether anyone was expecting her arrival at specific locations by particular dates. Initially, Rebecca interpreted these questions as evidence of the family's commitment to providing personalized service to their guests. Frontier travel involved numerous variables and potential dangers, so detailed information about each traveler's needs and circumstances would logically help the Thornfield women provide better advice and assistance. However, Rebecca also observed that the family's questioning seemed systematic rather than casual. Each woman focused on specific types of information, and they appeared to be building comprehensive profiles of every guest rather than simply making friendly conversation. Helena concentrated on financial and social status. Constance evaluated physical capabilities and defensive resources. Prudence assessed medical vulnerabilities and health-related weaknesses. Temperance gathered intelligence about travel routes and timing. The waystation's location, while convenient for travelers, also provided remarkable isolation from outside observation or interference. The nearest established settlement was more than 2 days' travel away, and the mountain terrain created natural barriers that would prevent anyone from approaching the facility without being detected well in advance. For a family engaged in legitimate business, such isolation meant freedom from taxation, regulation, and competition. For a family with darker intentions, it meant complete freedom from accountability or oversight. Rebecca also noticed that despite the waystation's remote location and limited customer base, the Thornfield women possessed an unusually extensive inventory of high-quality merchandise. Their stock included items that would typically be found only in well-established eastern cities: fine fabrics, precision instruments, expensive jewelry, rare books, and luxury goods that seemed inconsistent with the purchasing power of typical frontier customers.
When Rebecca inquired about the source of such impressive inventory, Helena explained that her family had developed relationships with Boston merchants who provided merchandise in exchange for furs, raw materials, and other frontier products. She also mentioned that many travelers left items at the waystation for extended periods, sometimes never returning to reclaim their possessions due to death, injury, or changes in their travel plans. These abandoned items could then be sold to other travelers who needed supplies. The explanation was entirely plausible, but something about Helena's manner during this conversation made Rebecca slightly uncomfortable. There was a practiced quality to Helena's responses that suggested she had answered similar questions many times before. And her explanations seemed almost too comprehensive, as if she was trying to anticipate and address doubts that Rebecca had not even expressed. Rebecca also observed the family's behavior toward other guests during her visit. Two other groups of travelers were staying at the waystation: a young missionary couple traveling to establish a church in a western settlement, and an elderly man who claimed to be a physician relocating his practice to serve frontier communities. The Thornfield women treated all their guests with apparent warmth and generosity, but Rebecca noticed that each family member seemed to be systematically gathering intelligence about the other travelers' circumstances and plans. Helena engaged the missionary couple in detailed discussions about their religious denomination, their sponsoring organization, and the specific location where they planned to establish their church. She also asked whether church officials would be expecting regular communications and whether the couple's families knew their exact travel route and destination. Constance spent considerable time evaluating the missionary couple's physical conditioning, travel experience, and defensive capabilities. She offered to teach them basic wilderness survival skills and weapon handling, using these lessons as opportunities to assess their strengths and vulnerabilities systematically. Prudence conducted what appeared to be friendly medical consultations with all the guests, asking detailed questions about health conditions, medications, and medical history. She claimed to be gathering this information to provide better emergency care if needed, but Rebecca noticed that Prudence seemed particularly interested in information that would help predict how quickly guests might succumb to injury or illness. Temperance engaged everyone in extensive conversations about travel timing, route selection, and weather planning. She provided detailed forecasts and travel advice, but she also gathered comprehensive information about each group's planned movements, alternative routes, and contingency plans. Most disturbing was the family's treatment of the elderly physician. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore claimed to be traveling west to establish a medical practice in a frontier community that desperately needed professional health care. The Thornfield women showed him extraordinary hospitality, treating him almost like visiting royalty, and expressing deep admiration for his commitment to serving underserved communities.
However, Rebecca observed that the family's questions to Dr. Whitmore focused heavily on whether anyone was expecting his arrival, whether he had family or colleagues who would search for him if he disappeared, and whether he was carrying valuable medical supplies or equipment that could be useful to other practitioners. Helena seemed particularly interested in Dr. Whitmore's financial resources and the valuable items he might be carrying. Rebecca departed the waystation the following morning with mixed impressions. The Thornfield women had provided excellent service at reasonable prices, and their advice about trail conditions and weather had proven accurate and helpful. Their hospitality appeared genuine, and their commitment to serving travelers seemed admirable. Yet Rebecca could not shake the feeling that she had been systematically evaluated during her visit, studied with an intensity that went far beyond normal business interest or frontier curiosity. The family's questioning had been so comprehensive and systematic that it felt more like military intelligence gathering than casual conversation. Rebecca's medical training had taught her to trust her instincts about people, particularly when those instincts suggested potential danger. Her military experience had reinforced the importance of paying attention to subtle behavioral cues that might indicate hostile intentions. The Thornfield women had triggered both her medical and military warning systems, though she could not identify specific evidence of wrongdoing. As Rebecca would soon discover, her instincts about the Thornfield family were far more accurate than she could have imagined. The systematic intelligence gathering she had observed was not casual conversation or thorough business practice. It was reconnaissance conducted by predators who understood that information was the most effective weapon in the isolated wilderness where they had chosen to hunt. The seemingly caring questions about health, travel plans, and personal circumstances were actually assessments designed to identify the most vulnerable targets and determine the optimal methods for eliminating them without detection. The Thornfield women had perfected a system that allowed them to appear as angels of mercy while functioning as instruments of calculated death. Over the coming months, Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Ashworth would uncover evidence that the Thornfield waystation was not a haven for desperate travelers, but a carefully constructed trap designed to identify, isolate, and systematically murder anyone unfortunate enough to seek shelter there. The four women who appeared to embody the best of frontier hospitality and female compassion were actually among the most dangerous predators in American history, using society's assumptions about women and motherhood to mask a killing enterprise that had claimed dozens of lives. The story of how Rebecca Ashworth uncovered this horrific truth and the methods the Thornfield women used to turn compassion into a weapon represents one of the most disturbing chapters in the criminal history of early America. It reveals how easily evil can hide behind the mask of virtue, and how the most trusted institutions of frontier society could become instruments of systematic murder. The Massachusetts that Helena Thornfield claimed as her new home in 1787 bore little resemblance to the prosperous colonial province that had sparked the American Revolution barely 2 decades earlier. The war had extracted a devastating toll on the region's economy, social structure, and population. Entire communities had been decimated by military conscription, with some towns losing over half their adult male population to battlefield casualties, disease, and the chaos of military campaigns that stretched from Canada to the Carolinas. The economic aftermath proved even more destructive than the immediate wartime losses. Massachusetts had borrowed heavily to finance its contribution to the Continental Army, issuing promissory notes and bonds that the new state government struggled to honor. Currency inflation had rendered many paper assets worthless, while British trade restrictions had closed traditional markets for New England's agricultural and manufactured products. Farmers who had mortgaged their land to support the war effort found themselves unable to repay their debts, leading to widespread foreclosures and forced migrations westward. Into this environment of economic desperation and social upheaval, Helena Thornfield had arrived with what appeared to be substantial financial resources and a compelling personal narrative. She claimed to have liquidated her late husband's estate in Boston, converting property holdings and military compensation into hard currency that would allow her to establish a new life for herself and her daughters in the Western Territories. Helena's story of widowhood and sacrifice resonated powerfully with communities that had experienced similar losses. Captain Marcus Thornfield, as Helena described him, had allegedly served with distinction in the Continental Army's artillery units, participating in major engagements from the Siege of Boston through the final victory at Yorktown. His military service record, according to Helena, included commendations for bravery under fire and technical expertise in managing heavy artillery operations. The details of Helena's background story were both emotionally compelling and difficult to verify independently. She claimed that Captain Thornfield had been killed during the final weeks of the war, struck down by British artillery while positioning American cannons for the siege operations that ultimately forced Cornwallis to surrender. Helena described her husband's death with appropriate grief and dignity, explaining that he had died knowing that his sacrifice was contributing to the birth of American independence. The details of Helena's background story were both emotionally compelling and difficult to verify independently. She claimed that Captain Thornfield had been killed during the final weeks of the war, struck down by British artillery while positioning American cannons for the siege operations that ultimately forced Cornwallis to surrender. Helena described her husband's death with appropriate grief and dignity, explaining that he had died knowing that his sacrifice was contributing to the birth of American independence.
Helena's account of her financial situation also seemed plausible and admirable.
She explained that Captain Thornfield's military compensation, combined with the sale of family property in Boston, had provided her with sufficient capital to relocate westward and establish a business that could support her daughters while serving the broader community. Rather than remaining dependent on charity or remarrying quickly for financial security, Helena had chosen to create an independent economic enterprise that would demonstrate women's capability for business leadership on the frontier. The three Thornfield daughters each possessed skills and characteristics that complemented their mother's business vision while creating a comprehensive service offering for frontier travelers. However, Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Ashworth's subsequent investigation would reveal that the daughters' remarkable abilities had been developed through years of systematic training in techniques that had little to do with legitimate commerce or frontier hospitality. Constance Thornfield, the eldest daughter, presented herself as a remarkably capable woman who had learned traditionally masculine skills out of necessity following her father's death. She could handle horses with expert precision, repair wagons and equipment with professional competence, and perform heavy manual labor that many frontier men would find challenging. Her physical strength and endurance were genuinely impressive, allowing her to work for extended periods without apparent fatigue. However, Constance's skills extended beyond simple manual labor into areas that suggested more specialized training. She possessed detailed knowledge of human anatomy that went well beyond basic first aid or practical medicine. She could discuss muscle groups, bone structures, and vital organs with the precision of someone who had studied these subjects systematically. Her understanding of weapon mechanics and combat techniques was remarkably sophisticated, for a woman's military knowledge should have been limited to stories told by her deceased father. Most disturbing was Constance's apparent familiarity with methods for restraining and controlling other people. She could tie knots with professional expertise, knew how to construct improvised binding systems from common materials, and demonstrated knowledge of pressure points and physical vulnerabilities that could be exploited to incapacitate someone quickly and quietly. When questioned about these skills, Constance claimed they were necessary for managing difficult horses and handling injured travelers who might become delirious or combative during medical treatment. Prudence Thornfield, the middle daughter, had developed medical knowledge that far exceeded what most frontier women possessed. She could diagnose illnesses, treat injuries, and manage medical emergencies with competence that rivaled formally trained physicians. Her knowledge of herbal remedies and traditional medicines was encyclopedic, encompassing treatments for everything from common colds to complex surgical procedures. Prudence's medical library was particularly impressive for a frontier establishment. She possessed detailed anatomical texts, surgical manuals, and pharmaceutical references that would typically be found only in urban medical practices or academic institutions. When asked about the source of these valuable books, Prudence explained that they had been inherited from her father's military medical colleagues or purchased from traveling merchants who specialized in educational materials. However, Prudence's medical interests seemed to focus disproportionately on topics related to death and dying. She possessed detailed knowledge of poisons, toxic plants, and substances that could cause illness or death when administered in specific dosages. She could discuss the symptoms and progression of various fatal conditions with clinical precision that seemed more appropriate for a coroner or toxicologist than a frontier healer. Prudence also demonstrated unusual expertise in determining time of death, identifying causes of mortality, and recognizing signs that might indicate whether someone had died from natural causes or deliberate harm. She claimed this knowledge was necessary for providing proper medical care in isolated regions where formal medical examination might not be available for days or weeks after someone's death. Temperance Thornfield, the youngest daughter, possessed meteorological abilities that bordered on supernatural in their accuracy and scope.
She could predict weather patterns days or weeks in advance, assess trail conditions based on minimal information, and provide travel advice that consistently proved accurate and valuable. Travelers who followed Temperance's recommendations typically arrived at their destinations safely and on schedule, while those who ignored her advice often encountered serious difficulties. Temperance's weather prediction methods appeared to combine scientific observation with intuitive understanding of natural patterns. She studied cloud formations, wind patterns, animal behavior, and atmospheric conditions with systematic attention to detail. She maintained detailed written records of weather patterns, seasonal variations, and long-term climatic trends that would have been valuable to academic meteorologists if such professionals had existed in 1789.
However, Temperance's knowledge extended beyond weather prediction into areas that seemed less innocent. She possessed detailed information about travel routes throughout the western Massachusetts territories, including knowledge of alternative paths, abandoned trails, and remote locations that were not commonly known even to experienced frontiersmen. She could discuss the seasonal accessibility of various routes, the availability of water and shelter along different paths, and the likelihood that travelers using specific routes would encounter other people during their journeys. Most significantly, Temperance seemed to possess comprehensive information about the schedules, habits, and movements of other frontier businesses, settlements, and transportation operations. She could predict with remarkable accuracy when specific traders would be traveling particular routes, when seasonal migration patterns would bring groups of settlers through various territories, and when official representatives like territorial commissioners would be conducting inspection tours. The Thornfield waystation itself reflected the family's systematic approach to what appeared to be legitimate business operations. Helena had invested substantial resources in creating a facility that provided genuine value to frontier travelers, while positioning the family to gather comprehensive intelligence about everyone who sought their services. The physical layout of the waystation demonstrated careful planning and strategic thinking. The main building was positioned to provide clear views of all approaches to the facility, making it impossible for anyone to arrive without being observed well in advance. The structure itself was built with remarkably sturdy construction that could withstand severe weather while providing defensive advantages if the occupants needed to resist attack. The sleeping quarters were designed to accommodate guests comfortably while ensuring that the family maintained complete control over access and movement within the facility. Each guest room had only one entrance, which could be secured from outside the room without the occupant's knowledge. The rooms were positioned so that conversations could be overheard from adjacent spaces, allowing the family to monitor their guests' private discussions and plans. The dining area served as a natural gathering place where all guests would interact with the family and with each other, creating opportunities for systematic information gathering disguised as social conversation. The large fireplace and comfortable seating encouraged guests to linger for extended periods, providing the family with time to conduct thorough assessments of each person's background, resources, and travel plans. The waystation's storage facilities were extensive enough to accommodate large quantities of merchandise, supplies, and personal effects. The family maintained separate storage areas for different types of items, with some spaces that were kept locked and off-limits to guests. Helena claimed these secured areas contained valuable inventory or dangerous items like gunpowder that required special handling for safety reasons. Most strategically significant was the waystation's location relative to alternative travel routes and communication networks. The facility was positioned at a natural bottleneck where multiple mountain passes converged, making it nearly impossible for westward travelers to avoid the waystation entirely. At the same time, the location provided easy access to numerous alternative routes that could be used to transport goods, dispose of unwanted materials, or disappear quickly if circumstances required rapid departure.
The nearest established communities were far enough away that the way station operated with complete independence from external oversight or regulation. Local authorities had no regular contact with the facility, and there was no systematic monitoring of who was staying at the way station or what business activities were being conducted there. For a family engaged in legitimate commerce, this independence represented freedom from bureaucratic interference. For a family with criminal intentions, it represented complete immunity from accountability. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Ashworth's initial encounter with the way station had occurred during a routine territorial inspection tour in October 1788. Rebecca's official duties required her to visit frontier establishments periodically to ensure compliance with territorial regulations, assess security conditions, and gather intelligence about potential threats to public safety. Rebecca's background had uniquely prepared her to recognize patterns and anomalies that less experienced observers might miss. Her medical training at Harvard College had taught her to observe symptoms, analyze evidence systematically, and develop diagnostic conclusions based on careful evaluation of available information. Her military service had reinforced these analytical skills while adding expertise in tactical assessment, threat evaluation, and strategic planning. During her overnight stay at the Thornfield way station, Rebecca had noted numerous details that seemed individually unremarkable but collectively suggested something worth further investigation. The family's questioning of guests was more systematic and comprehensive than typical frontier curiosity would explain. Their inventory of merchandise and supplies seemed inconsistent with the facility's remote location and limited customer base. Their knowledge of regional conditions and activities was remarkably detailed and current.
Most significantly, Rebecca had observed that the family's behavior toward different guests seemed calibrated based on each person's apparent vulnerability and resources. Wealthy travelers received extraordinary attention and service, while those with limited means were treated politely but with less engagement. Guests who appeared physically capable and well-armed were approached with more caution than those who seemed defenseless or naive. Rebecca had also noticed that the way station's guest register contained numerous entries from travelers who claimed to be heading to specific destinations, but whose stated travel plans seemed inconsistent with optimal routing or seasonal timing. Many guests had listed arrival and departure dates that would have required them to travel during periods when weather conditions made such journeys extremely dangerous or impossible. Following her visit to the way station, Rebecca had made inquiries with other frontier establishments and territorial officials about the Thornfield family's reputation and business activities. The responses she received were uniformly positive, with numerous testimonials praising the family's hospitality, competence, and commitment to serving travelers' needs. However, Rebecca had also discovered that very few people could provide specific examples of successful travelers who had definitely stayed at the Thornfield way station and subsequently arrived safely at their intended destinations. Most testimonials were based on general reputation rather than direct personal experience or verified outcomes. This pattern had prompted Rebecca to begin maintaining her own records of travelers who mentioned plans to visit the Thornfield way station during their westward journeys. Over the following months, she attempted to track whether these travelers had successfully completed their journeys and arrived at their stated destinations on schedule. The results of this informal investigation would soon reveal a pattern of disappearances that was far too systematic to be explained by the normal hazards of frontier travel. Travelers who visited the Thornfield way station were vanishing at rates that were statistically impossible unless something was systematically eliminating them after they left the facility. Rebecca's medical and military training had taught her to trust statistical analysis and pattern recognition as tools for identifying problems that might not be immediately obvious through casual observation. The mathematical probability that so many travelers would disappear after visiting a single establishment suggested that the way station was not the safe haven it appeared to be, but rather a carefully constructed trap designed to identify, isolate, and eliminate vulnerable travelers. As winter approached in 1788, Rebecca began developing plans for a more thorough investigation of the Thornfield family and their business operations. She understood that direct confrontation would be premature and potentially dangerous without more substantial evidence. Instead, she would need to gather intelligence systematically while avoiding actions that might alert the family to her suspicions. The challenge would be investigating a family that had demonstrated remarkable skill at reading people's intentions and motivations. If the Thornfield women were indeed responsible for the disappearances that Rebecca suspected, they would likely recognize and respond to any obvious surveillance or investigation efforts. Rebecca would need to employ the same systematic intelligence-gathering techniques that she suspected the family was using, turning their own methods against them. The winter of 1788–89 would prove to be the most dangerous and revealing period in Rebecca's territorial commission career. As she prepared to delve deeper into the Thornfield mystery, she could not have imagined the scope of horror that she was about to uncover, or the sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been masquerading as frontier hospitality in the remote mountains of western Massachusetts. The truth about Helena Thornfield and her daughters would challenge every assumption about women's roles in frontier society, the nature of maternal instincts, and the capacity for evil to disguise itself as virtue. The systematic murder operation that Rebecca was preparing to expose would prove to be one of the most calculated and ruthless criminal enterprises in American history, conducted by women who had turned society's most trusted feminine roles into weapons of unprecedented lethality. By March 1789, Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Ashworth had documented the disappearances of 18 separate parties who had last been seen at the Thornfield waystation. Her meticulous records showed a pattern too systematic to be coincidental. Travelers with valuable possessions, limited connections, and unclear arrival expectations vanished at a rate of nearly 90% after visiting Helena's establishment. The breakthrough came when Rebecca discovered the Thornfield family's true method of operation during an unannounced inspection visit. Arriving at dawn during a late winter storm, she found the waystation apparently empty except for Helena, who claimed her daughters were visiting relatives in Springfield. However, Rebecca's trained eye noticed fresh horse tracks leading to a concealed ravine behind the main building. Following the trail through knee-deep snow, Rebecca discovered what the Thornfield women had hidden for nearly 2 years. A mass grave containing the remains of at least 30 individuals, along with a systematic disposal operation that rivaled anything she had witnessed during wartime military campaigns. Helena Thornfield had not been running a waystation at all. She had been operating a killing ground.
The Thornfield women's system was devastatingly efficient. Helena would identify travelers carrying significant wealth or valuable goods during their initial information-gathering sessions. Prudence would then administer carefully measured doses of slow-acting poisons disguised as helpful medicines or added to evening meals, ensuring victims would not die immediately but would become progressively weaker over several hours. Temperance's weather predictions served a darker purpose. She would deliberately advise poisoned travelers to depart during severe weather conditions, when their weakened state would ensure they died from exposure before reaching the next settlement. Any bodies discovered would appear to be victims of natural causes rather than murder. For travelers who proved too hardy for poison or weather exposure, Constance would follow them along remote trail sections and eliminate them directly, using her anatomical knowledge to ensure deaths appeared accidental. The family's extensive knowledge of regional geography allowed them to choose disposal sites where bodies would never be found. When Rebecca confronted Helena with evidence of the mass grave, the older woman's facade finally cracked. Gone was the grieving widow and devoted mother. In her place stood a calculating predator who had spent decades perfecting murder as a business enterprise. Helena revealed that Captain Marcus Thornfield had never existed. She had been born Helena Blackwood in London's criminal underclass, where she learned pickpocketing, fraud, and eventually graduated to more serious crimes. Her 3 daughters were actually recruited accomplices, street orphans she had trained from childhood in specialized killing techniques. The family had operated similar schemes in Pennsylvania and New York before relocating to Massachusetts when their previous territories became too dangerous. They had refined their methods over years of practice, learning to identify the most vulnerable travelers and eliminate them with minimal risk of detection. Rebecca's investigation ultimately revealed that the Thornfield operation had murdered at least 47 people over an 18-month period, stealing an estimated £12,000 in cash, goods, and property, an enormous fortune in 1789 currency. The family had planned to continue operations indefinitely, using their accumulated wealth to establish similar enterprises in other frontier territories as westward expansion created new opportunities. They viewed murder not as crime but as business, with travelers serving as livestock to be harvested when conditions were optimal. Helena Thornfield and her 3 daughters were arrested in April 1789 and transported to Boston for trial. All 4 women were convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death by hanging, unusual for the period as women were rarely executed even for serious crimes. Helena showed no remorse during her trial, treating the proceedings as an intellectual exercise and critiquing the prosecution's evidence with the detached interest of someone reviewing a competitor's work. Her final statement expressed regret only that she had been caught before perfecting her system for larger-scale operations. The Thornfield waystation was burned to the ground by angry locals, and the site was abandoned for decades afterward. Travelers avoided the area entirely, claiming the location was cursed and that the spirits of murdered victims could be heard crying in the mountain winds. The Thornfield case shattered contemporary assumptions about women's capacity for systematic violence and criminal leadership. Legal scholars struggled to explain how maternal figures could become such calculating killers, while medical professionals debated whether such behavior represented madness or simply evil unconstrained by moral limitations. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Ashworth's investigation methods became a model for criminal investigation techniques, demonstrating the importance of statistical analysis and pattern recognition in identifying crimes that might otherwise appear as isolated incidents or natural accidents. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of frontier communities to systematic predation, leading to improved communication networks and more regular territorial inspections designed to prevent similar operations from establishing themselves in isolated regions. Rebecca Ashworth continued serving as a territorial commissioner until 1795, when she retired to write detailed accounts of her investigative work. Her journals, discovered in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives in 1987, provide the most complete documentation of the Thornfield murders and remain studied by criminologists researching early American serial killing. In our modern era of easy communication and rapid transportation, it's difficult to imagine how completely isolated frontier travelers were from help or oversight. The Thornfield women exploited this isolation with systematic precision, turning hospitality into homicide and transforming maternal care into methodical murder. What do you think about this disturbing chapter in American criminal history? Could such systematic predation occur in our modern world? Or have technology and communication eliminated the isolation that made the Thornfield murders possible? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more investigations into America's darkest historical mysteries. Remember, the most dangerous enemies are often those we trust most completely. History shows us that evil rarely announces itself with obvious warning signs. Instead, it hides behind familiar faces, trusted institutions, and the very virtues we're taught to respect and admire. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you in the next investigation.